Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. This is our next episode in the Navigating Complexity series, and we're going to shift focus from being entirely about Gaza and Israel and the ongoing conflict there as it's now spread to many other areas of the region. We're going to focus on the Houthis in Yemen, who launched attacks starting about 19 October against shipping in the Red Sea that they claimed had links to Israel. Since that point, they've continued to employ missiles and UAVs, and even more dramatically, a recorded VBSS, or Visit Board Search and Seizure action against the maritime vessel Galaxy Leader. I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Christopher Anzalone. He's a research assistant professor with Middle East Studies and the Krulak Center. He has a PhD in Islamic, Middle Eastern, and African Studies from McGill University, a master's in Near Eastern Studies from Indiana University, Bloomington, and a double bachelor's in History and Religious Studies from George Mason University. He was previously a research fellow with the International Studies Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He has published and lectured extensively on non-state armed groups in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, as well as on political Islam and Muslim social movements and organizations. So Dr. Anzalone, welcome back to the Broadcast. You've been on a few with Ian in the past discussing topics that were also in this region. So I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Major Janikin. And start off our discussion today just talking about the Houthi movement, or as it calls itself, the partisans or the supporters of God, the Ansar Allah movement, which is in Yemen, right at, of course, the Red Sea and Bab al-Mandab, Gulf of Aden, as we all are very familiar with now. This is when they took over about 2/3 of the population of Yemen in 2014, 2015, the Houthis basically have continued to present themselves as the inheritors, if you will, of the Yemeni state. So they in the attacks that they're carrying out now on international shipping and now our sort of our own ships and British ships as well, in the last sort of several weeks or so, they have done that in the name they claim of the Yemeni state, of the Yemeni armed forces. So in this photograph, for example, we can see a mix of the Yemeni national flag, Houthi sort of iconography, the leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi, as well as the Yemeni armed forces emblem. So just very briefly, who are sort of the sort of main players right now in Yemen? So there's the internationally recognized Yemeni government, of the Republic of Yemen, the ROY. It basically, what that is, it exists only in the south. It is based in the city of Aden in the far south, the major port city in the south, and it is the sort of continuation of the government that came into power in 2012 after the ouster of the country's longtime president Ali Abdullah Saleh in 2012 during the Arab Spring in Yemen. And the former sort of the president who took over after Ali Abdullah Saleh in 2012, he was a man named Abdul Rabu Mansour Hadi. So President Hadi stepped down in April of 2022, and he has been replaced by what's called the Presidential Leadership Council, or the PLC. The current president of that is Rashid Al-Alami. The idea of the PLC was to bring together into one body all of the anti-Houthi sort of main factions under sort of one umbrella. The issue that the PLC continues to face is that many of these groups have very divergent sort of interests, goals, and sort of visions of of Yemen. They don't agree. What they do agree on is that they dislike the Houthis and they don't want the Houthis to take over the country, but they don't agree, many of them, on much else. And in some cases, it seems that they actually arguably dislike each other more than they dislike even the Houthis. Then we have Ansar Allah, or the Houthi movement. The Houthis, I'll just call them, sort of during our discussion today. There are new and old. So there's the old guard, sort of the original supporters and members of the movement, and then there are newer sort of folks who have joined, particularly after late 2014, 2015, when the Houthis began taking over about a significant amount of territory in Yemen, and they currently rule over about 2/3 of the Yemeni population. So the head of the movement, the head of Ansar Allah, the Houthis, is a man named Abdul Malik al-Houthi. He's the brother of the founder of the movement, a man named Hussein al-Houthi, who was killed in 2004. But he doesn't have a sort of an official. He has an official role, but not an office. So the president, if you will, of the Houthi sort of Houthi-backed Yemeni government is a man named Mahdi al-Mashat, who's also a longtime member of the Houthi movement. And then we have the Southern Movement, or the Southern Transitional Council, which is its most sort of visible sort of segment of the Southern Movement. The Southern Movement is a separatist movement. They sort of fluctuate between sort of how loudly and actively they agitate for Southern Yemen, South Yemen to become an independent country, as it was for most of Yemen's modern history. The current head of the Southern Transitional Council is Eidarus al-Zubaydi. He basically, what the Southern Movement, the STC, has done for the last several years is set up sort of parallel institutions to the internationally backed Yemeni government. So the STC, ideally, if it was to have a choice, be able to make this choice, would want to have certainly a fully autonomous, if not an independent, South Yemen as a separate country from and no longer a united Yemen. So Yemen has only been united since 1990. So the existence of a united Republic of Yemen is quite new, even though Yemen as a land, as a place, is quite old. And there are a number of different sort of paramilitary groups backed by either the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia that are made up of Yemenis, but that receive external training and funding and weapons and equipment. And these are some of them: the Giants Brigades, the Security Belt Forces, the Shabwa Defense Forces, and the National Shield Forces. And one of the issues that has faced what we often refer to as the Saudi UAE coalition in Yemen against the Houthis, which began operations against the Houthis in 2015, is that there is sometimes, particularly in the Western press, Western news media, they're talked about as if both the UAE and Saudi Arabia have the same set of goals and interests in Yemen, and that is not the case. And so they support different factions within the anti-Houthi sort of side of the equation, and those groups they use those groups to sort of push forward their own interests, which are often quite divergent. So the main problem, in a nutshell, for the anti-Houthi part of the equation in Yemen, sort of set of forces, is that they don't really have a strong unifying voice or sort of set of goals. Really, the only thing that ties them together in many cases is the dislike and opposition to the Houthis, but that isn't always enough, hasn't been enough to keep them to sort of maintain a cohesive sort of united plan to move against the Houthis. So the Southern Movement, the picture on the top for those who are looking at watching the video of this is the South Yemen flag when South Yemen was an independent country from the 60s to 1990. And the bottom photograph is from April of 2023 after the China-mediated. So we'll talk a little bit more about the Houthi movement and where they fall sort of in the broader sort of geopolitics of sort of the Middle East region. So the Houthi movement claims that it wants to be seen as holding the legitimate mantle of the Yemeni nation state, that it is now in control of the nation state of Yemen. It doesn't want to do away with the Yemeni national state. So it is a non-state actor, but it exists in a space that in sort of academic political science and international relations, there is not really a good or clear-cut definition or sort of categorization of what exactly a movement like the Houthis is. Because yes, they are a non-state actor in the sense that they're not internationally recognized. However, they're not a non-state actor, for example, like Al-Qaeda, for example. So they have, not only do they have control of a significant part of an existing country, they also seek to be recognized as the inheritors or those that control that state. So I would say they're a non-state actor, but with a sort of a big caveat to that. So the international community has had a difficult time sort of determining exactly how to interact with the Houthis, because, and this is one of the reasons, because they because of this sort of netherworld, if you will, that they occupy between non-state and state actor. So their narrative, the main Houthi narrative, is that they are engaged in a conflict or a series of conflicts. They themselves see the conflicts as linked, of national defense, again, national defense of Yemen against what they call external aggression from the Saudi United Arab Emirates and the other Arab states involved in the coalition that was formed against them in 2015. Ultimately, they see that as being backed by us, the United States, by Britain now, by other sort of external powers, and they see themselves as being the main group in Yemen that is, quote unquote, defending the Yemeni state, Yemeni national sovereignty. When they talk about the Red Sea, when they talk about the Bab al Mandab, when they talk about the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea, they talk about defending Yemeni maritime national sovereignty. That's how their narrative framing of what they're doing is, and that's how they present it to the, not only to the international audience, but also to the domestic Yemeni audience, sort of their core sort of sets of sort of supporters and audiences that they're trying to reach. From November of 2016, and it was just dissolved late last year, sort of early in the fall of 2023, they, under sort of Houthi auspices, they formed or allowed the formation of what they call the National Salvation Government, but they dissolved that in September of last year. So the Houthis fit in sort of a broader picture of Iranian, Saudi Arabian sort of regional competition, which has played out in a number of different sort of countries and locations across the Middle East, as well as further abroad. So in Lebanon, for example, in Syria, in Iraq, as well as in Yemen. The involvement of both of these countries, as well as other external actors, has arguably exacerbated internal divisions within the different sort of within Yemen and between different Yemeni factions. It didn't create them, but it has in some cases exacerbated them, I would say. It has also affected, like particularly the Saudi UAE et al. Intervention in 2015 has also affected and shaped to some degree how Houthi foreign policy, and also constrained it. So it has forced the Houthis to sort of make calculations that they otherwise would not have. But despite the rhetoric sort of between the two, the Houthis and Saudi Arabia in particularly, they have been engaged in regular sort of contact and negotiations, and usually mediated by the Omanis, who are very active diplomatically in the region. So ongoing now and before October of last year, there had been an uptick in negotiations because Saudi Arabia is trying to find a way to withdraw from the conflict in Yemen, but they want to do that with an agreement from the Houthis that guarantees that the Houthis will stop sort of cross-border attacks, both on the ground and with missiles and drones. So the Saudis have been trying to do this for a number of years. After the China-backed mediation in March of last year, when that was publicly unveiled, in April, the month after, there was a senior level visit by the Saudi ambassador to Yemen, and a Saudi and Omani diplomatic delegations to Sana'a, the federal capital of Yemen, to meet Mahdi al-Mashat, the Houthi government's president. So the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, considers the Houthis, and the Houthis speak of themselves as being part of the so-called Axis of Resistance, sort of a series of coalition of groups aligned with the IRGC, the Quds Force of the IRGC, against sort of what they call the sort of U.S. and Israeli-backed sort of regional order. In the photograph, for those who can see the image on the screen and the video, this is a flag that the IRGC designed for the Houthis, but the Houthis themselves never have used this flag themselves. So I think it's illustrative of how the Houthis are an integral part, particularly now, of the Axis of Resistance coalition, but they also sort of retain a lot of their own independence and agency. So this is debated, but the Houthis pre-existed the relationship that they had with Iran, and likely, even if there was a dramatic change and a total stop to Iranian support, it would be much more difficult for them to obtain, for example, weapons, particularly more advanced weapons like missiles and drones, some naval mines, but the movement itself would not disappear. The Houthi government governance has gone through different stages, three main stages primarily since September 2014, early 2015. The first was they took over, they formed an alliance of convenience with the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been their bitterest enemy when he was president of Yemen. But Saleh was very upset that he basically was forced out of the presidency, and so he formed with the Houthis this marriage of convenience. They didn't trust each other, but they had shared a common goal, which was to delegitimize the internationally backed Yemeni government, federal government. So the Houthis take over with Saleh, Saleh and his supporters in his party, the General People's Congress. The Houthis don't assert total control over the different local, provincial governance bodies and structures that they take over. They do name supervisors from their own movement to make sure that provincial governors, for example, remain loyal, but they don't try to micromanage local governance from the capital. 2018 to 2019, they gradually but continuously start to expand the role of their supervisory system, basically to ensure that local government officials toe the line, the Houthi line. And then finally, beginning in about the middle of 2019, continuing on to now, they've increasingly appointed their own officials, and they've increasingly taken away the level of autonomy or independence that local government officials, including the district directors and provincial governors, have had. So one of the ways that they've done this is to require provincial governors now to send all of the tax revenues and other revenues from their provinces back to Sana'a, to the Sana'a branch of the national bank, whereas beforehand they allowed the governors to keep locally collected taxes in the provincial bank offices. So the Houthis have beginning in 2019, began to coalesce centralize power more in their own hands and more within the capital. So under the Houthis, the Yemeni governing systems have become very, very centralized, possibly, arguably more centralized than they have been in any time in Republican history. So as they expanded territorially into new regions, the Houthis were able to convince some local government officials, local tribal officials, tribal chiefs, particularly those who claim descent from the Prophet Muhammad, who are called Sayyids, to join them. This was both a benefit because it gave them an influx of new members and new supporters, so it bolstered their ranks, but it also presented them with and presents them with a problem, which in the political science literature is called the free rider problem, which is that when you attract supporters that are with you when the times are good, but they may not and likely will not be with you when and if times become bad. Basically, they're with you because they see that there's a benefit to being with you, but if push comes to shove and you start to decline, they're going to jump ship pretty quickly. So the Houthis face this challenge of trying to make sure that these new supporters and new members, to make sure that they don't revolt and they don't jump ship. So the Houthis have tried to do that by using a very extensive system of supervisors that they appoint to make sure that provincial governors and local district officials remain loyal. This has also led to tensions within the Houthi movement itself, between the original membership of the movement and newer members and recruits. So the old guard, members of the old guard, sometimes have felt, we've been Houthis since the beginning, since the 1990s, and now you have all of these newer members, and they're getting a lot of stuff that we didn't get, and we resent that. So there have been disputes between different segments of the Houthi movement as it's grown larger since 2014, 2015. So the Houthis are an integral part of the so-called axis of resistance. The relationship between the Houthis and Iran has become closer since 2013, 2014, certainly. So the ongoing Yemeni civil war, the relationship has become particularly strong. Before, there was a very, at least publicly, close relationship between the Houthis and Iran. Directly, the Houthis developed a very strong alliance with Lebanese Hezbollah. So the Hezbollah, particularly in the realm of media, particularly in the realm of sort of organizational sort of instruction, has been very influential on the Houthis. So the Houthis, if we look at one of the basically their main satellite television channel, which is called Al Masira, when we look at Al Masira, and if we were to look at Al Manar, which is Hezbollah's satellite television channel, it's very clear when we compare these two channels that the Houthis have taken a lot in terms of production, in terms of when Abdel Malek al-Houthi speaks, he basically, in many ways, mimics when Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah speaks. There's been a lot of influence there. There has also reportedly been sort of military training that Hezbollah has sent sort of military commanders and trainers to Yemen at various periods of time to also help the Houthis sort of better their organization, particularly in the lead up to 2014 and also after. Iran's sort of direct sort of influence and sort of connections are the clearest in the sort of this new influx of more sophisticated weapons, drones, multiple types of drones, both surveillance and armed, as well as one-way attack drones or kamikaze drones, suicide drones, whatever we call them. The armed sort of speedboats that they use, which are very much like the IRGC Navy's speedboats, radar systems, guidance systems for missiles, and sort of a range of different cruise and ballistic missiles, surface to surface, surface to air, and naval missiles, which they're using now against us, against international shipping, against the British, as well as naval mines, which include a whole range of them, including sort of dumber, if you will, sort of older mines, as well as sort of newer influence mines. But the Houthis claim now that they're able to sort of manufacture at least some of these weapons domestically. It seems from sort of recent reporting, news reporting, that is the case, at least with some of the less sophisticated drones, for example. They tend to sort of build industrial production sites deep within urban centers, which makes them more difficult to target. And so there's a range of different sort of weapon systems and other military equipment that Iran has provided the Houthis, and has most affected sort of the Houthi sort of expansion in terms of its capabilities, sort of military capabilities. The Houthis have proved to be, beginning in 2004 to 2010, when they fought a series of wars against the Yemeni central government under President Ali Abdullah Saleh. The Houthis have faced, for their entire history, basically a technologically superior set of opponents, right? Whether that's the Saudis and the Emiratis, the UAE, whether that's us and the British. And so they have faced, externally at least, opponents that have far superior, more advanced technology. So the Houthis, beginning in 2015, began to develop sort of tactics and other kinds of methods to try to, as much as possible, blunt those sort of advantages that their opponents had. So, for example, they developed ways of moving personnel, sort of fighters, along front lines in very, very small groups, sometimes just a few people at a time on a motorbike or two, being able to then still maintain on the front lines enough personnel to man positions within several kilometers. They have been much more careful, sort of as the conflict continued from 2015 onward, how they use communications, trackable communications technology, to make it more difficult to track their communications and being able to target their sort of key leaders and commanders, like whether that be political leaders or military commanders. They had a much better understanding, both in 2004 to 2010, than the Yemeni central government, of the terrain in the far north where the government was trying to fight them. It was the Houthis' home turf. The Yemeni government did not perform well in any of those wars. They're called the Sada Wars with the Houthis. Fast forward to 2014, 2015, the Houthis also had a much better understanding, at least for the northern part of Yemen, of the terrain, both socially and geographically, in fighting with the Saudi UAE Arab coalition. The Houthis made a lot of mistakes the further south they went. A large part of the reason for this is because this is well outside of their region where they have can count on a significant amount of local support. So when they went to Aden and around Aden, they were rolled back north from Aden, partly for that reason. So they've been very limited in their use of what's called lawfare, using sort of international law against their opponents. They're not very sophisticated, or haven't been certainly nearly as sophisticated as some other axis of resistance groups, particularly Hezbollah, which seems to suggest that, at least for most of the history of the relationship, that the amount of direct Iranian sort of investment and trust in the Houthis compared, again, to, for example, to Hezbollah is much weaker than it is with Hezbollah. So turning now to the sort of Houthi discourse on the maritime spaces, which is particularly relevant in geopolitics that we're looking at today, sort of as since October of last year. So the Houthi emphasis on this desire, intent, question mark, it's sort of unclear how much of this was rhetorical and how much of this was forecasting the movement's intent about defending, again, in their view, Yemeni national maritime sovereignty and territory, not only around the coasts, but including islands like Socotra off the coast of Aden, and Mayun, or the Param Island, which both of these islands are believed to have UAE bases of some sort. This began far earlier than October 2023, when Hamas launched its attack on southern Israel, and when the Houthis then a week or two later began to attack international shipping in the Red Sea. The Houthis were talking about this at least as far back as 2022, and really even further back than that. But there, in sort of the second half of 2022, there was an uptick in Houthi discourse and narrative about, again, quote unquote, defending Yemeni national maritime sovereignty, and announcing their intent at some point to try to take it back, and try to take back again Socotra, Param Island, etc. So they specifically mentioned in 2022 as well the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, Bab al-Mandab, the Arabian Sea, all of the same bodies of maritime spaces that they began talking about and specifically mentioning beginning again in October of 2023. So this discourse goes farther back than 2023. So it's important, I think, to note that it's not, it didn't, the Houthi narratives and discourses about these maritime spaces didn't begin in October of 23. Even in December of 2022, the rhetoric that was coming out of the Houthis about their intent for the next year, for 2023 of the Yemeni civil war, was that they were going to launch larger scale attacks. This is a direct quote from Abdul Malik al-Houthi. But then what happens again in March, April 23 is the China brokered Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, the beginning of that at least, and then this exchange and this uptick in negotiations, direct negotiations between the Houthis and the Saudis over trying to reach an agreement between the two of them to end the Saudi involvement in the Yemeni civil war. So that the Houthi sort of discourse then sort of decreased in terms of its sort of militancy. Then we have the 7 October attacks, and 8 October onward is when the Houthis begin not only attacking commercial shipping, which they claim erroneously is all Israeli shipping and now Israeli, British, and American shipping in the Red Sea, and that all other countries are free to use the Red Sea. That's not the case. That's very clear. But they also began launching one-way attack drones and various missiles at southern Israel, particularly at or around the city of Eilat, which is a resort city at the southern tip of Israel. And they did this in the name of the Yemeni state, the Yemeni armed forces, the Yemeni nation. They claim to be acting for the Yemeni state in launching these attacks. So the images, for those who can see them, are stills from the Houthi video of them hijacking the Galaxy leader. And actually, if we look at the bottom photo, for example, the headband shows Hamas's military spokesman, the Palestinian national flag, and then the name that Hamas gave to the October attacks, the Al-Aqsa flood or the Al-Aqsa storm, Tufan Al-Aqsa. The next sort of series of images are images, and I'll talk about them for those, again, who are watching the video. This was a Houthi poster that they released, digital poster on their official sort of media organs right after the hijacking of the Galaxy leader. So what it says is this is the beginning, and then the image on the left was released right after poster on the left, or on the right rather, was right after they launched the first series of drone and missile attacks aimed at Eilat in southern Israel. That we will not be silent. So this image is a still. We see the Yemeni and the national flag, the Palestinian national flag, that they raised on the Galaxy leader once they had taken control of it. This image we can see, if you look at sort of the small arms speedboats, this is very tactically, we can see the influence here of the IRGC in particular, sort of how it operates in the Arabian Gulf. And so this is one of the ways with a helicopter, but also with these small armed speedboats, how they took control and hijacked the Galaxy leader. And they landed, sort of used the helicopter to land sort of fighters onto the deck, and where they took over the ship, the entire ship and the interior. So they've launched a number of different kinds of drones and various kinds of missiles, ballistic and cruise missiles at southern Israel. These are the same types of weapons that they're using against us, against the British, against commercial shipping. Sort of, again, the one-way attack drones. This is from the first set or batch of them, if you will, that they launched at southern Israel in October. In the bottom left picture, we can see sort of a series of four one-way attack drones. So it seems that this is how they launched them, been launching them sort of in sort of clusters. We see the Palestinian national flag in the picture in the top left, and then the Houthi banner on the picture in the bottom right-hand corner. So on the left in this image, again, for those, apologies to those who are maybe listening to the podcast and can't see this, but is a translation of the statement of the general who is the spokesman of the Yemeni armed forces, the armed forces which are aligned with the Houthis, about the start of their attack campaign, if you will, of drones and missiles, launching drones and missiles at the Israelis, sort of why they're doing it, why they claim to be doing it, and what the goal is. The top right is an image from October of last year from one of the Houthi websites. It says, "You are not alone," and it shows General Saria, who's the spokesman of the Yemeni armed forces. And then it also shows the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad military spokesman, and a picture of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the final picture is of a Houthi military parade from last year, or from 2022 actually. So the Houthis, when they took over the Yemeni military, basically took over and haven't changed a lot of it organizationally. They basically took over and kept the professional military that sided with them largely intact and largely organized along the same sort of parameters in terms of units, in terms of geographical sort of disposition as before they took over. So in late December of last year, which is when sort of our military strikes with the British began against Houthi sort of missile sites and sort of naval sites along the coast, which they were using, have been using, continue to use in targeting international shipping, was that the Abd al-Malik al-Houthi, sort of earlier this month, or earlier last month, January 4th, said basically, he reiterated that naval attacks, that the Houthis intend to continue using these attacks as a way to pressure Israel through economic means, that the US, he said, is complicit in the Gaza war because we provide money, weapons, and what he called media and political cover to the Israeli state, and that the US government, our government, is beholden to the Zionist lobby. These are all his language. And that the criminal act, his term, the clashes between our forces, between British forces and the Houthis, will not go unanswered. Again, a direct quotation. So what are there's a significant, of course, commercial, economic impact of essentially what is essentially a kind of blockade by the Houthis on sort of open use of the Red Sea. Yeah, these are numbers from earlier in January. About 15% of global seaborne shipping goes through the Red Sea. 20% of the world's container ships are now, again, as of last month, are avoiding the Red Sea, according to the International Chamber of Shipping. And that's affected, for example, other countries. For example, the port cities in Africa, which is where many of them that would go through the Red Sea and then to the Suez Canal are now, because they're avoiding the Red Sea, are going um, around the southern tip of Africa. And even Africa's largest and most advanced port, deepwater port, which is in Durban, South Africa, are having a very difficult time, and they really are not capable, sort of in terms of processes and in some cases technologically, of handling this significant increase in port usage in this sort of short amount of time. So it's putting a lot of pressure on other regional ports and docking sort of stations and areas, particularly in Africa. So the Houthis, the way that they talk about this is an image for those who can see it of the sort of Houthi naval fighters that were killed when they were trying to hijack a boat, and our navy intercepted them and stopped them, prevented them from doing that. The Houthis here in this poster describe what they're doing as part of the Al Aqsa flood battle, and also the battle of the promised conquest and the sacred jihad. This is what they call it. The promised conquest is a reference to an Islamic historical sort of text attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, where supposedly the Prophet Muhammad foretells that there will be a promised conquest that precedes the end of time, the day of judgment, when God will come and judge all of humanity. On the poster, it also says of the 10 Houthi naval fighters who were killed. It quotes a part of a Quranic verse, basically about martyrdom and martyrs, that those who have died in the path or for the sake of God, that they're not dead, that they are actually alive in the afterlife in heaven. They're being well provisioned for by God, and God will, perhaps, if He wills it, bring victory and conquest. The poster, they've also, this is where it's very important and is very illustrative also of the importance of local and domestic dynamics in Houthi. What the Houthis do is the 10 fighters who were killed in late December in the clash with our naval forces are identified by their where in Yemen they're from, down to the sort of the locality. So there is a strong, not only geopolitical and international components of what the Houthis are doing now with all of the attacks that they're carrying out, perpetrating in the Red Sea, but there is also a very strong domestic component that, not unrelated to the Houthis, that there is strong social support societal support rather, within Yemen for the Palestinian cause. This predates the Houthis. That also, this is a way that the Houthis seem to think that they can bolster, at least to some degree, what had been flagging levels of domestic support, because the Yemeni civil war, essentially for the last several years, has been bogged down essentially in a sort of a status quo. There hasn't been a lot of movement on either side. So this is a way that the Houthis see potentially of winning over or sort of reinvigorating their support base, or in a way that would not have been possible otherwise. So there's a very strong sort of local dynamic, or domestic rather dynamic, to what as well as an international geopolitical dynamic to what the Houthis are doing. The Houthis continuously since October 7th, October 8th. This has continued since we have started launching airstrikes against Houthi missile positions with our British partners. For example, today, again, I was just looking at sort of Houthi media channels, and every Friday after the Friday congregational prayers in all of the provinces of Yemen where they have a strong sort of level of control and presence, they organize and hold mass rallies. And we see those who can see the photographs can see Palestinian flags. We see a portrait of Qasem Soleimani, of Abdel Malak al-Houthi, of Hassan Nasrallah. So they use what's going on now regarding the Red Sea as a way of bolstering domestic support for themselves. The Houthis are very media savvy. This is where, again, one of the areas that we can most clearly see the influence that Hezbollah has had on them in terms of organization and media strategy. Here in this image, for those again who can see, we see multiple camera media operatives basically, as well as the use of drones to capture different shots. This is something that the Houthis do on a regular basis, and it just is very illustrative, one of how media savvy they've become, and B, of the influence that another axis of resistance group, so-called Hezbollah, has had on the Houthis organizationally and tactically. The Houthis in September of 2022, publicly unveiled sort of a range of different, again, missiles and other weapons, drones, mostly sort of modeled or directly from Iran. There are some, again, surface to surface, but also something that they really highlighted was the naval component, naval weapons, the armed speedboats, different sort of naval missiles. One of them shown here in an image is literally called the Red Sea missile, naval missile. So obviously very clear, not ambiguous at all in terms of the messaging there. So fast forward to sort of the middle of last month, the United States government, redesignated the Houthi movement, Ansar Allah, as a specially designated global terrorist group. In a nutshell, it reimposes sort of particularly financial sort of constraints on the Houthis. U.S. citizens may not provide any financial or other material support to the Houthis. It'll freeze any assets that the Houthis may have in the United States. It's unclear how much that will actually affect the Houthis, just because the Houthis are not particularly haven't been particularly well tied into the international sort of monetary system. So how much this will affect them is unclear. We didn't designate them yet, at least as an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization, which is sort of in a nutshell, a broader sort of categorization, which comes with sort of broader legal ramifications, travel ramifications for Houthis, the members of the Houthi movement. But what the humanitarian community, sort of aid community, has said, and again, we'll see to what degree this is the case, is that the designation will make it more difficult to operate in Yemen, particularly in Houthi-controlled areas, to provide humanitarian aid and relief with the designation. That's the sort of the counter argument against the designation. But again, we'll see how that plays out. But it's important to note it. Sort of next series of images. Again, I just wanted to sort of illustrate sort of the Houthi discourse since the beginning of U.S. and British airstrikes. So a poster of aircraft carriers, a battleship, I believe, being attacked. Again, a sort of an AI image, produced image, and a quote from Abdel Malik that the American and British enemy will not be able to break the Yemeni armed forces' resolve to prevent the passage of any ship linked to the Israeli entity from the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, whatever the cost, and that this is the American-British dilemma in Yemen's quagmire. And that's a quote from Abdel Malik al-Houthi. The next image is of a Houthi poster, a martyr poster, if you will, of some of their military personnel who were killed in the first set of our strikes with our British partners on Houthi military sites in Hudaydah and other locations. Again, using the same Quranic verse that those who die in the path or for the sake of God they may have died in this life, but they're alive in the afterlife. After the designation on 17th of January, the announcement of it by Secretary Blinken, the Houthis released a series of propaganda posters. Some of them we can see here. All of these are direct quotations from Abdel Malik al-Houthi from a speech that he gave right after the designation. So the American terrorist designation comes only in the context of protecting Zionist criminality. And then it shows the Statue of Liberty, but with the face of a skull. The next propaganda poster, a quote again from Abdel Malik, that the American attacks and designations are of no importance. They have no importance. And we see an American soldier with the face of a skeleton in the propaganda poster. Next, again, a very sort of skeletal image of the Statue of Liberty, and Abdel Malik, a part of his speech where he says that the American position does not frighten us or affect us or disturb us at all. And next sort of image is of a poster is of an American soldier, and then of a literal demon. And Abdel Malik says that America is the fountainhead of criminality, terrorism, and tyranny, and it isn't in a position to classify others as such. sort of shifting from Yemen to sort of the other sort of most active fronts where the IRGC Quds Force has been most active with its set of allies and proxies is Iraq. So there's a new front organization umbrella which calls itself the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, which is launched. I believe the number is now almost 180 different missile and drone attacks on our U.S. bases, our bases, and other stations, including Tower 22, but also sort of across different parts of Syria and Iraq, in Erbil, for example. That the Islamic Resistance in Iraq is basically, it's a front umbrella organization. It includes a number of different groups. Exact ones were, at least in open source, we're not sure, but we have a pretty good idea of the main sort of Iran aligned groups, Iraqi groups that have composed other earlier sort of front groups. So images here are on the left of one of the type of drones that the, again, so-called Islamic Resistance in Iraq front has been using against our military bases and positions in Syria and Iraq. And on the right-hand side is the statement in which the Islamic Resistance in Iraq front claimed a series of attacks, including the ones near Rukban, which killed our service members. So it's an umbrella. The groups that are most likely comprise the Islamic Resistance in Iraq front umbrella are the Hezbollah brigades, or Kata'ib Hezbollah, the brigades of Sayyid al-Shuhada, or Kata'ib Sayyid al-Shuhada. The third group is Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, or Harakat Nujaba, and the fourth is a group called League of the Righteous, or Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq. So there have been other earlier sort of Iran-aligned front organizations of Iraqi militant groups. One is called Ashab al-Kaf, which was particularly active in 2019 and 2020, and just a day ago they sort of reactivated. Talk a little bit about that in just a little bit. The Islamic Resistance in Iraq front emerges publicly in mid-October of 23 last year. The first claimed attack was on the 17th of October. It was a drone attack on the Harir Air Base near Erbil. Talk a little bit now about these groups. So the Kata'ib Hezbollah sort of was formed in 2006. It built on earlier groups, Iran-aligned groups that were directly tied to the IRGC Quds Force that began coalescing in 2003 after the toppling of Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party. It's officially part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, or the Hashd al-Shabi. It was designated by us, by the State Department, as a foreign terrorist organization in July of 2009. Its top leader, founding leader, was Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was killed by us along with General Soleimani in January 2020. He had very close ties historically with the IRGC. He was also he was able to navigate internal rivalries within Kata'ib Hezbollah itself, which has been somewhat of an issue for them after he was killed. Its current leader is a man named Abdulaziz al-Muhammadawi. He was designated by us as a specially designated global terrorist in January of 21, and this is the group. Kata'ib Hezbollah is the main group that is suspected of being the perpetrator of the attack on 20th January, which killed on Tower 22, which killed our service men and women. On 30th of January, just a few days ago, they publicly announced, Kata'ib Hezbollah, that they were going to suspend attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq. Again, whether that's true or not, they made this announcement. What is very interesting and important, and it illustrates how different Iran-aligned groups still maintain a degree of agency or independence, is that another faction, Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, just today said that, or late last night said that they respected that Kata'ib Hezbollah's decision was to suspend for now its own attacks, but that Harakat al-Nujaba doesn't have the same intention, and that all of the quote-unquote Islamic resistance groups in Iraq can make their own decisions regarding whether they'll halt attacks or not. So jumping a little forward, sort of in the slide for those who can see, to Harakat al-Nujaba. It formed in 2013. The Secretary General is a man named Akram al-Ka'bi. He broke away. He was a member of Kata'ib Hezbollah. He broke away in 2013. primarily up until the last several years, particularly in 2013, until Mosul fell to Islamic State, ISIS in 2014. Harakat Hezbollah Nujaba was very active in recruiting Iraqi fighters to go fight in Syria on the side of the Syrian regime. That's primarily what it was used for in 2013, 2014. When the PMF is formed in 2014, after sort of Islamic State is expanding sort of dramatically across large parts of Iraq, it then sort of returns largely home to Iraq and begins to sort of organize and mobilize there. We conducted a strike on the 4th of January, which killed a sort of a senior commander in Nujaba, a guy named Abu Taqwa Sa'idi or Mushtaq al-Jawari. The third group, Kitab Sayyid al-Shuhada, again was a group that the IRGC sort of coordinated with to recruit Iraqis to go fight in Syria, particularly in 2013. It again is also part of the PMF rather, as is Harakat Nujaba. They are all part officially of the state-recognized popular mobilization forces. It was formed also by former members of Kataib Hezbollah, so we can see this sort of shift of some members of existing Iran-aligned groups leave and then form their own groups, which they then also align with Iran. So this is can be useful because it allows the IRGC to have a range of different partners, particularly when some of its partners sometimes are not that cooperative. Sayyid al-Shuhada, is also was recognized as a specially designated global terrorist group, as was its leader, a man named Hashim al-Saraji. So one of the other very important sort of Iran-aligned groups is the League of the Righteous, or Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq. It was founded in 2006. It was a splinter movement initially from the Sadr movement, the movement of Muqtada Sadr. Its leader then and now is a man named Qais al-Khazali, who was in U.S. detention for several years before he was released. So Asa'ib, or the League of the Righteous, is a foreign terrorist organization designated in January of 2020. Both of its leaders, Qais and Laith, his brother, al-Khazali, are designated designated global terrorists, also in the same month and year, January 2020. It was very active in Syria in 2013, 2014. It has tried, not very successfully, particularly, but to also develop an official political parliamentary bloc in Iraq. It did pretty well initially. It won 15 seats in 2018 in the Iraqi parliament, but in the most recent elections in 21, it only won 4 or maybe 5 seats. So it actually declined in popularity. So here we see, for those who can see these images, Qais al-Khazali on the bottom left, we see Muqtada Sadr, and then right next to him in the white turban, Qais al-Khazali when he was still a member of the Sadr movement. And to the right, we see a portrait of Qais al-Khazali and Muqtada's father, who was a very senior Shiite jurist, religious cleric named Muhammad Sadaq Sadr. So Qais al-Khazali claims his supposed religious juridical authority because at one point he was a seminary student under Muqtada's father, who was a grand ayatollah. And then very briefly to close, just talk a little bit about sort of what Lebanon's Hezbollah has been doing sort of since October of last year. Its history is pretty well known, particularly I think to the Marines who are listening. Won't go into detail about that. I will say that that it is, Lebanon, the Lebanese Hezbollah is the most and the oldest and the most organized and sophisticated, if you will, group within, again, the so-called axis of resistance. It is also important, I would add, just to our thinking about what Hezbollah's own domestic within Lebanon issues, concerns, dynamics are, because those do exist. The further that Hezbollah has become involved and active in sort of Lebanese domestic politics, that adds another set of calculations that its leadership has had to take into account. So far, it seems that Hezbollah's leadership has, one, wanted to show some sort of, for lack of a better word, solidarity with Hamas and with its Palestinian allies, but it also wants to do that in a way that is still not short of a full-scale conflict with Israel. And so it has tried to sort of maintain, it seems, this balance sort of within a certain uh, sort of set of actions that it can take without risking a full-fledged or full-scale rather conflict with the Israelis. So it's been very careful. Its discourse is on the current conflict. This is a Hezbollah graphic design. It shows the Dome of the Rock, which of course is one of the iconic buildings on the Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount in the old city of Jerusalem. We see a Hezbollah sort of a funeral cortege procession with the Palestinian national flag holding it in this image. And on the bottom it says martyrs, or Hezbollah's martyrs, the over 100 fighters that have been killed in the sort of ongoing strike and counter-strike with the IDF. Martyrs on the path or on the road to Jerusalem, that they've died on the path to liberating, again in their language, their view, Jerusalem. And then last slide sort of shows a segment, sort of two different Hezbollah sort of statistical reports about between October of 2028 of 2023 and the 5th of January of this year, what Hezbollah claims to have done and used in its attacks, sort of again strike, counter-strike with the IDF. And for the sort of the listeners, that so Hezbollah between this period of 8th October 23 and 5th January of this year claimed that they fired 182 artillery shells, 98 surface-to-surface missiles, conducted 50 sniper attacks, launched 257 guided missiles, usually anti-armor, anti-tank, wire-guided missiles, used 17 attack drones, 33 anti-air weapons, mostly against Israeli drones, 4 engineering operations, 68 other attacks with what they call direct weapons, not identified specifically, and 135 other types of weapons against mostly IDF targets, but also against some civilian settlements and towns in northern Israel, like Kiryat Shimona, which they historically have bombarded fairly frequently. Hezbollah also claims that it's targeted 43 IDF military vehicles, including 20 tanks, 670 military targets of various types, which include 18 command centers or posts, 181 technical sites, like, for example, communications towers are among those technical sites, 1 radar platform, and 11 artillery positions, and that they claim that they've also shot down 4 IDF surveillance drones, like the Skylark 2, and some other smaller surveillance drones. So this is sort of where the sort of strikes and counterstrikes between the two sides, the IDF and Hezbollah, have continued along sort of similar lines since the 5th of January, when these statistics end. And so with that, I'll close, and happy to answer any questions, Major Janikin. Thank you.
We're coming up on our hour, but I did prioritize some questions I had. So the first one I had was, you talked about their propensity or ability to do media and the recording. I think it was pretty intense watching that VBSS. Other than guys flagging each other with their rifles, it seemed like a pretty decent VBSS action. But some of those images and the phrases they're putting on their images, who is this media actually targeted at? Because it gives a real strong vibe of Saving Private Ryan as they're running through the town, and the guys on the loudspeaker, their Statue of Liberty is kaput. It's the comment was, well, that's disconcerting. So who's this media actually aimed at?
That's a great question. So the short answer is that it's aimed at multiple audience. But there is a very strong domestic component, and also within the Middle East or Arab world, there's a very strong element of these are 2 target audiences that this media is primarily aimed at. It is also, they want to take advantage of the strong sort of societal support within Yemen for the Palestinian national cause. This is a historic support, or support that has existed historically. Also the sort of the sentiments that have been growing as the war in Gaza has continued among sort of the broader sort of Arab world. Then international, outside of the Middle East, it's also a way of them demonstrating sort of internationally in a way, kind of a claim to legitimacy, that we are the Yemeni armed forces, the Yemeni national forces, state forces are carrying this out. It's a way, basically, of saying to the international community that we are claiming to be the Yemeni state. So there's sort of three different audiences or sets of audiences that it's this kind of media. This media is trying to reach sort of simultaneously.
Yeah, I think that actually feeds into my next question was, you said, the Houthis control about 2/3 of the Yemeni population. What is keeping them from controlling 100% of the population?
So yeah, so it's another good question, great question. So basically the short of it is that they overreached when they went further south toward Aden. They don't have any sort of natural sort of social basis of support in the far south. And then also it was better coordination in 2015, 2016 of sort of local anti-Houthi forces, and then also internationally to help together to roll back the Houthis back north and so to where the front lines are, which is north of the city of Aden now. So there's a combination of sort of Houthi hubris, I would call it, sort of, and also rapid expansion, sort of that outpaced their ability to consolidate control, and then also sort of better coordination, at least at that time, of sort of domestic and international sort of forces, regional forces, in coordinating together to roll back Houthi advances. So the Houthis learned a lot from that. They again, since 2019, have begun to focus more on consolidating their power, their sort of intelligence gathering, sort of their supervisory networks in the areas of Yemen that they still control. So they've learned, they've taken lessons learned from that experience back in 2015, 2016.
Are they doing in the parts that they do control? Are they doing the standard stuff that you would expect, like any government to do? Taking care of the people, essentially.
No, they don't, and so they have left that or outsourced that, if you will, or abandoned that to the responsibility largely to external aid organizations. They have shown that they are very callous. They do not care how much the sort of the everyday Yemeni suffers, even though they claim to be representing them. They do not care. They are able to weather sort of the blockades, right? Themselves, they hoard materials, food, etc., for their own medicines, for their own sort of members and fighters. They don't care about the local population. So they're very impervious to any sort of pressure. They are very afraid of domestic revolt. That is something that they are very afraid of, for good reason, particularly in areas that they don't have strong sort of social bases, pre-existing social bases of support. But they don't really care about how much the local person suffers. So one of the questions is about how sort of normal ways, whether that's sanctions or other pressures that may be used against them, how much that will actually affect them. And then also with the our strikes, the British strikes, is given sort of the way that they're sort of the nature of them right now, which is more limited, strategic but limited, is one, the Houthis. This fits well within the Houthi narrative. They see the 2015 Arab coalition military intervention into the Yemeni civil war as essentially being an American sort of directed thing anyway. Again, this is their narrative about it. So it fits very well within their narrative right now that they are now directly being attacked. And that's what Abdel Malik al-Houthi has said, is that since 2015, we have essentially, Yemenis have essentially been undergoing an indirect American attack. Now the attacks are direct, right? So they've gone from indirect to direct. It's not really much of a change for us. This is, again, the Houthi, Abdel Malik talking. So it fits very well domestically in some ways. Like they're not probably unhappy about it because it allows them to make certain sort of messaging claims, propaganda messaging claims. And then two is barring sort of, yes, it's disruptive. They would prefer that they were not being struck, but to what degree will that change sort of the Houthi hold, sort of more broadly speaking, sort of on the ground domestically? It's unclear.
Yeah, and I think that actually answered my last question, which was exactly, will our strikes affect them? So I think all of your answers have led perfectly into my very next question. So with that, I think our time is complete. I did want to give you an opportunity to have any closing words if you needed any.
No, so the only thing I would add, sort of for your last question, is that and you would know much better than I would about other ways other than sort of the types of sort of airstrikes, basically missile strikes, of sort of targeting Houthi sort of nodes of, whether that be sort of military or command and control through other methods that are whether that's special operations, whether that's some other sort of more covert ways, that there are other ways. So they are affecting the Houthis, but it's unclear. And it seems that the Houthi, and I'll close with this, that the Houthi calculation right now is that if the strikes remain limited, that yeah, they would prefer if they weren't happening at all, but that they can weather them, and that it's not really going to affect them. It'll affect Yemenis, but they have already shown that they really totally disregard what happens to the sort of Yemeni civilians. They don't care. I mean, they're very, very callous in that regard. So barring sort of a major change, it's unclear to me, how, to me personally, whether this, anything really will change their situation on the ground.
Great. Thank you. Sir, thanks for your time today and your insight. I don't know a whole lot about the Houthis in Yemen, and I feel like I know a little bit more, just enough to be dangerous, perhaps. So that's all we have for this episode. So go ahead and carry out the plan of the day.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.